may begin.
Hi, I'm Karen Safer. Today is Tuesday, October 12th, and I am interviewing Jerry Safer. So, Jerry, would you tell me when and where you were born?
I was born on July 2nd of 1932, and I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Mount Sinai Hospital.
Does your family name have any special significance?
The family name is Safer, which in Hebrew means book, but the derivation is the Hebrew Sofer, which means that somewhere in the very, very distant past, some member of our family was a scribe, and we don't quite know who that is, and we'll never know.
Who were the first family members to settle in the United States?
First family members that I know that settled in the United States was my great-uncle, Eli Tannenbaum, who settled in this country and made his way to Fond du Lac, and was the head of a company called the Eli Company, which basically after a while was a company that had the liquor and tobacco concessions for most of the Fox River Valley. But he stayed up in Fond du Lac. He married and then divorced his wife in the middle 30s, which was a huge scandal, and then married a woman that he had corresponded with from the old country, somewhere in the Ukraine. And that's his story. But the next person to settle was, that I know of in my family, was my father's father, whose name happened to be Joshua, but everybody called him Sam, for reasons that nobody can figure out. In any event, he came to this country prior to the First World War by himself, and the rest of the family, that is on my father's side, came to this country following the First World War. In terms of my mother's family, I really don't know, except that her family had relatives, or there were relatives in Bay City, Michigan. How they got there, I have no idea. And they came here again prior to the First World War.
How did your parents come? What kind of money enabled them to come to the United States?
Well, starting with my mother's family, and her maiden name was Rotman. I have no idea exactly how much money they had, except that I do know that my grandfather, that is my mother's father, was a hat maker, and he lived, I don't know, somewhere in the 16th, 17th Street area. My father came to this country without very much money at all, initially from Kovel in the Ukraine. He then made his way to Vienna, where he was a member of Hechalutz. And from there he decided that rather than going to Palestine, even though he had kept in contact with all the people there, he came to this country so that he could meet up with his father and to bring out the rest of the family. He came to this country in the early 20s, and he also became a cap maker for a very short period of time. And then then he became a printer, and then he became a grocery store owner.
Did you grow up in a Jewish neighborhood?
Well, I started out by my first home in Milwaukee was a home in Mount Vernon, the street called Mount Vernon, which is the Merrill Park area, which is really an Irish neighborhood, because that's where my father had his grocery store. So, but after that, in 1938, my father, having frankly made a fairly nice living, decided that he would buy a wonderful house on the west side of Milwaukee, one of the first pioneers to move to the west side. And he bought a house on 46th and Meineke, and that's basically where I grew up from 1938 on until I left home. And so I went to school at High Mount Grade School, from there to Steuben Junior High School, and from there to Washington High School, on to university, et cetera, et cetera.
Did your family belong to a synagogue?
My family, that is my father, being a socialist Zionist, was not too keen, frankly, on the orthodoxy, and not too keen on the people who were steeped in religion, because he felt that they were rigid, stultifying, and so forth. But he did have an extraordinarily good Jewish education. His knowledge of Hebrew was fine. He had also good facility in language, so therefore his English was excellent. He also had his first language was Yiddish, and while he spent a year in Vienna, he was able to pick up a goodly knowledge of German. So he was quite good in languages, but even having the good Orthodox background that he had, he was not going to be very much of a synagogue goer. However, he wanted to have a decent Jewish education for his children, so therefore I went to the Yiddish Volksschule for a very short period of time, but then because we moved to the west side, the synagogue that I initially went to was Bethel, which was at that time located on Garfield Avenue, just across the street from Highmount Grade School. And he belonged, as my family belonged to Bethel. And they remained members of Bethel, frankly, until they died.
I'd like you to segue into your own family synagogue or Jewish background.
Well, my Jewish background starts out with Bethel and the good Rabbi Zwitschko, who was a bit of a tyrant, but nevertheless was a very knowledgeable man. I had my bar mitzvah was there in Bethel on Garfield Avenue. But my own Jewish background was really was made important to me not so much by the synagogue, but was made important to me by my parents, was made important to me by the whole Jewish milieu that I grew up with, and was especially made important to me because at about the age of 13 or 14, I became a member of Habonim, which was the labor Zionist group, and that was probably the major influence that I had in terms of my Jewish life, because at that time it was extraordinarily exciting, because the State of Israel was established, as you know, in May of 1948. But nevertheless, prior to that time, the labor Zionist movement in Milwaukee was quite strong, and so therefore we were all vigorously supporting the establishment of the Jewish state following the Second World War, and I was a part of that. We, as teenagers, were responsible for keeping the, in quote, movement going. We went ahead and ran groups. I was a group leader, I think, at the age of 14. We went ahead and constructed a camp, and I remember that I was working on construction without any adult supervision, by the way, at the age of 15. And therefore, that was a deciding and integral part of my life. Following the establishment of the State of Israel, I graduated high school, went to the university, and when I went up to Madison, which was 1952, the person really had also a strong influence on me was a Hillel rabbi at that time, Max Tickton. And so that, I think, those things, I think, were the pivotal moments, at least in the early part of my life.
Were your parents involved in Jewish communal life?
My father was a member of the Poet Zion and was also a member of Farban, but was not really that active, although he knew everybody who was a part of the movement. My mother, on the other hand, was very, very active in Pioneer Women, which is now Na'amat, and she was the first president of the Council of Pioneer Women of Milwaukee. So she was very, very active in the Jewish community here in Milwaukee. But neither of them was active in anything in synagogue life because that wasn't that important to them, although they were members. And at that time, the synagogues were only one of a number of organizations that were active in Jewish communal life, unlike what we have today.
Did you have any war involvement?
Well, the war involvement that I had, let me just start with this. The war involvement that I had was aiding and to some limited extent smuggling some supplies over to, at that time, Palestine, before it became a state. So those of us who were in the movement were really quite active in gathering war, I can't say war material, but supplies that would be sent out to Palestine and even to Israel at that. Well, actually to Palestine. This was before Israel was established in May. So you had training farms in the east in New Jersey that were called hachshara, in other words, training camps before you would go on aliyah, in other words, immigration to Israel. And so in these camps, these were storehouses for various items that were sent over to the Yishuv, in other words, to the Jewish movement in Israel. And so I was somewhat active in that. But then following that, of course, in terms of more regular activity, I was drafted into the United States Army in 1954 and served for 2 years.
What was your involvement in Jewish organizations?
Well, as I said, I was a member of Habonim and very active in Habonim from the age of about 14, probably until the age of 20. And then active in Hillel in Madison, and when I went to law school, I was the assistant director of the Hillel Foundation in Madison for a couple of years. Following that, came back to Milwaukee, married you, and then we, after the birth of our children, started our own little organization in 1970, which was a part of the labor Zionist movement, and that was an organization that we formed, which was because we were so dissatisfied with the synagogues in Milwaukee in terms of what they could offer. They were very straight-laced and very rigid, and there wasn't that much in terms of participation. So we decided that we would do it on ourselves. Not only that, but at that time, the Jewish organizations were basically organized along sex lines. So that is, you had a men's organization, you had a women's organization, but never the two would mix. We decided to be revolutionary and actually have an organization that combined the two. So that's what we did, and we organized an organization called Atzmaut, the Labor Zionist organization. We initially had meetings with about 3 other couples, the two of us, and Dudi and Chassi Lutsky, Danny and Sandy Weinstein, and Danby and Marvin Ring were the 4, you might say, founding couples. We sent out announcements, and we found ourselves inundated with people. I think our first meeting we had about 60 to 70 people showing up. And we organized our own Hebrew classes because we had a number of people there who were good Hebrew teachers, and there was no adult Hebrew classes in the city at that time. We also, after a while, had services, and as a matter of fact, there was a little bit of a brouhaha in the city because we actually had services at the Jewish Center, and God forbid the synagogues went up in arms. Some of the rabbis were having a difficult time of it because the Jewish Center was actually open for the high holidays. But we did all these interesting things. We even ran a competing slate for the Board of Jewish Education at that time, and actually won, which also was a problem for some. But you can see we had a really a very interesting time, and we had a very, very knowledgeable, active group of people in the movement. Such people, and some of them aren't even here right now, but you have Bob and Sharon Friedman. Bob was a professor of political science at Marquette University. He's now the dean of the Baltimore Hebrew College. We had Dudi and Chassi, as I said, and Dudi, who's now no longer with us, was a professor of veterinary science at Marquette. You had Steve and Margot J., who joined us, Steve being the head of the Wisconsin Conservatory of Music. We had Manny and Sabine Rubin, Manny being the chairman of the music department at UWM. So we had a pretty good, and we also had Marvin Ring, who I mentioned over here. Marvin being the professor of Portuguese at UWM. Unfortunately, they closed the Portuguese department, so that meant to him and his wife that he ought to make Aliyah, and they did, and they're still in Israel. So we had this interesting group of people, knowledgeable as all get out, and we also had our children with us, of course, throughout, and our services were basically run by ourselves. They were traditional services, interestingly enough. They were ones in which the children took part. They were not children's services, they were adult services, but the children took part as part of an adult service. Something, by the way, that was something that we strongly supported, because what synagogues were doing at the time, probably some of them still do, is that they have the children shunted off to like junior services. We didn't cotton to that at all. We thought that the children would be part of the adult services, and they were, and they did very well.
So you mentioned
answer the question.
Yes, you did. You mentioned law school, which is the way you earned a living as being a lawyer.
Mm.
Would you have wanted to work in any other profession or work in your lifetime?
Well, in one word, the answer is no.
Okay. What was your involvement in the non-Jewish community?
Not limited, very limited, because most of my activity was in the Jewish community. But for a period of time, I was active in an AIDS coalition in Milwaukee when it was first started up. At that time, and we're talking about the 80s now, the beginning of the 80s. At that time, the city health commissioner, named by the name of Krumbiegel, assembled a number of people who he felt could be interested and could push the whole AIDS research and provide a haven for the people who had AIDS and HIV. So he assembled a number of people, and I was one of them. And so for a period of time, I was active in that. I also was, to some limited extent, active in the bar associations, and I'm still somewhat active in the bar association. But that's about it.
How do you connect to Israel?
Oh, well, my family is really. Oh, well, let me start with this way. The only branch of our family that I know of and that we can follow is my paternal grandmother, in other words, my father's mother. So what happened is that she and her sisters who got out of Europe before the Holocaust, her name was Esther, and her last name being Tannenbaum. She came to the United States and she came to the United States after the Second World War, as I said, and she was the mother of all my father and my aunts and uncles. So there's that group that we have here. Her brother, Simcha, did go to Palestine, and he was the father of innumerable children, some of them not having been able to leave Europe, but many of them going to Palestine. And then my grandmother's sister, Charnel, is that right? Charnel, went to Buenos Aires. So we have a whole clan that we're just getting more knowledgeable about in Buenos Aires. So my connection, therefore, is with the clan, obviously, in this country, but we have a very, very strong family in Israel that we have kept in contact with. And of course, my cousin and partner, Fred, and his family, that's my uncle Oscar and his children. His daughter made Aliyah and lives in Rehovot with her husband, who we are very close to. And of course, my partner Fred, also my first cousin, his two children now live in Israel, one in Jerusalem, one in Rehovot. And then of course we have all the relatives coming from Simcha, so we've kept basically in contact with them. So therefore, we have a very large family in Israel, and we've pretty much kept in contact with many of them.
As we celebrate 350 years of Jewish life in America, how do you see the present and future of the Milwaukee Jewish community?
Well, the Milwaukee Jewish community is interesting because of the changes that have been made. The Milwaukee Jewish community right now has, to its everlasting credit, extraordinarily strong federation. Also, it has always been, more than many communities, supportive of Jewish education. And therefore, what you have in Milwaukee is a fairly good Jewish educational environment. You have day schools that now provide an education to, I believe, something in the neighborhood of 700 children. And because of that, you have the strong possibility of having a good continuation of the community. You also have right now a movement afoot, of which I'm a small part, where you have the Hillel Foundation, which picks up after the children graduate high school, go on to the university, being funded more now than ever before. And you have the Federation in this community also helping to fund the Hillel Foundation in Madison, which has now become quite strong and has got a very, very large budget and is able to deal well, better than ever, because for a long period of time Hillel was not well thought of on many campuses, but better now than ever. And so you've got a very strong Jewish presence in Madison and a growing Jewish presence here in Milwaukee. So in terms of the Jewish community here, although there is intermarriage and all that happens, nevertheless you've got every facet imaginable of the Jewish community here, from one spectrum on the left to certainly spectrums on the right. But by and large, you've got a community that is good and strong, and also is not, and the members of it are not antagonistic to each other. They do manage to talk to each other. They manage to disagree all the time, but that's part and parcel of any Jewish community. But nevertheless, they are able to work together when the time comes where they need to work together.
What are you most proud of in your life?
Oh my God. I don't know. It was marriage and children. How about that?
I like that. Do you have any regrets?
Not any that I know of.
Okay. Can you identify the happiest moment in your life?
Well, our marriage, obviously.
Is there something about yourself that you think no one knows?
Not that I can think of.
How would you like to be remembered? My question was actually, what would you like Leora and Yoni and Eliana, who are your youngest grandchildren, to be asking you when they see this tape in 25 years?
I have no idea what they're going to ask. They're going to probably say, "How come you didn't say more?" Or maybe they said, maybe they're going to say, "How come you said so damn much?"
Is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't mentioned?
I don't really think so. I think just hit the high points of it all. I think that we are, at least the two of us, are really blessed in a strong way, because unlike a lot of families, we have kept in contact with our families. We have a strong family, both here in Milwaukee and in Israel, and we also have our children who have good Jewish educations, who have 2 out of 3 married well, and the third one over here is unmarried, and so there's a good continuation of that. So that's something that I think both of us can be very proud of.
Is there anything else you would like to say?
No.
Well, you have this opportunity.
No.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure interviewing you.
It was a wonderful thing to be interviewed by you.